Hey everyone, Leo is here. Another Johnson Lightning episode. I have two returning guests, Tony and Dima, to talk to me about Azure Device Registry and Azure Container Storage enabled by Azure Arc. Stay tuned. Hey everyone, Leo is here. Another Johnson Lightning episode. I have two returning guests, Tony and Dima. Guys, how are you doing?
Good.
Good, thanks, Lior.
So, starting with you, first of all, Tony, who you are, what is it that you do?
Yeah, so thanks, Lior. I'm a senior program manager. I work on the Azure Container Storage enabled by Azure Arc, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that is here
For
this
sure.
week.
You and I, we had a fun conversation last time and some good demos. I know that you have some good things for me today. Dima, how are you doing? Who you are? What is it that you do?
Yeah, I'm good, Lior. Thanks for having me back. I'm a product manager here at Microsoft working on Azure Device Registry.
So, guys, today we have a fun topic, Azure Device Registry, and also with the integration with Azure Arc and the Azure, Azure Storage, Azure Container Storage enabled by Azure Arc, and that integration. So, we'll come back to the storage part in a bit here. So, Tony, we'll say goodbye for now, and we'll bring you back in a second here. So, Dima, in the past, you and I we had a conversation about Azure Device Registry. I remember it was a fun conversation. It's also a very interesting topic because of it really brings to life the whole notion of enabling assets by Azure Arc and bringing those into the platform. So, as a quick reminder, Dima, what is Azure Device Registry?
Yeah, thanks, Lior. And yeah, for the listeners that watched our last episode, this will be a quick refresher, but I thought it'd be great for some of maybe our new
Yeah.
viewers and folks that want to catch up on this full episode in its entirety. So Azure Device Registry is a new service that we made available late last year. It is a unified registry for all things industrial assets and all things assets that our customers may be wanting to bring back into the cloud from their edge. And so think of it as a resource provider in Azure for assets. So whether that's a wind turbine, whether that's a CNC machine, all of those assets can now be represented as ARM resources. And so what does that mean for our users? That means that they're able to use that Azure management plane, whether that's resource groups or ARG or Azure policy. They're able to use all of that with their assets. And on top of that, all of those assets are synced down to the edge by ADR and exposed as custom resources on your Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah. And Dima, before we dive deeper into the use cases and the architecture and all of that, I wasn't joking when I was saying that this is really kind of you know I want to say the thing that we imagined when we started with Azure Arc, because at the beginning it was just servers, right? And we all know that this is now a common thing. It's very common scenario. People are Arc enabling their servers, their Kubernetes clusters, all good. But bringing these type of assets into the platform, that opens a brand new world, and when it comes to opportunities. So I'm super excited about ADR. I think that it really brings a lot of the things that we imagined that we'll be able to do with Azure Arc.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think it's fundamentally changing what customers are able to use Azure for. So, went from VMs and compute and storage, and now we're talking
Right.
about their connected appliances at the edge, their industrial equipment. All of that becomes part of Azure, which I think is super cool and super exciting to be talking
For
about.
sure.
So let's talk a little bit about high-level architecture. Again, it's a slide that folks are probably familiar with from Arc Jumpstart, but just to get folks a quick refresher, what we talked about earlier is we have all the way on the left side is the industrial edge. So this is something like your OPC UA server, your industrial assets, and those are connected to Azure IoT Operations, which is running at the edge. So if you have this cluster here in the middle, you've got your connectors, you've got your MQTT broker, you've got your schema registry, you've got your data flows. This is the kind of the heart of Azure IoT Operations, enabling you to take data from the edge, make sense of it, and eventually land it in the cloud. And if we look all the way on the far right of the picture here, we have the cloud portion of the diagram, which includes the operations experience, which is this purpose-built UX for operators looking to take control of their industrial edge from the cloud, and a lot of really exciting things that are tied to the schema registry that we'll talk about in just a bit.
Yeah. The schema registry and the thing that you're showing right now and the architecture, it really shows how everything is coming together. Because when we started with Azure IoT operations, the schema registry and the device registry portion of that was something that was kind of we were building this in stages, right? And that was the thing that was supposed to be on top of all the logic that Azure IoT operations in bringing. So the way that I like to look at Azure Device Registry is kind of the connected tissue between the data plane and the portion of that side of the house, right? Coming all the way, like I mentioned, from the edge, right? Your OPCUA, your broker and all of those good stuff, all the way to the cloud, which is what we just talked about, right? We talked about this notion of having those, projected resources. So that's really where ADR comes in.
That's right. That's right. I think if you want to think about where we started, we said, hey, now you can define your assets in Azure as ARM resources. So that's a great start. And now
Yeah.
these things like the schema registry are building on top of that. So not only are you able to define your assets, but now the messages that are generated by the edge have a common place for those messages to live. And now the user doesn't have to think about synchronizing the edge in the cloud. That's something that will come out of the box with the schema
Yeah.
registry feature that we're
Good
going to talk
stuff.
about today.
Good stuff.
So very high level for folks interested in the schema registry. So it's a feature of ADR. As I said earlier, it is a synchronization system that takes schema that are either created in the edge or created in the cloud and syncs them so they're available in both places. It serves as a store of those messages and the schemas for those messages that are at the edge, or it could be a user-provided schema that may come from another source. Like a lot of the services that we've been building in Azure Arc, they're backed by Azure ARM, Azure Resource Manager. You've got Azure Blob Storage that is backing those schemas in the cloud. And of course, as we'll talk about in a little bit, the Azure Container Storage enabled by Azure Arc is at the edge powering that schema registry. So with that, let's take a quick look and cover some of the flows that our users may be interested in from a schema registry perspective. So the first flow is our happy path that we are really excited to launch and to be talking about. And this is a flow that I like to call connector generated schema. So this means that at the edge, you are using some kind of an industrial connector, some kind of a connector that connects Azure IoT operations to your shop floor, to your retail environment, to whatever kind of a plant environment you might have set up. And the connector is able to generate a message schema. And in other words, it is able to tell you, here is a payload, it's got a bunch of values in it, and here's kind of the decoder ring to be able to take that payload and decipher it and to understand that the first value is temperature, second value is pressure, and so on. And so in this scenario, in this edge first flow, the schema registry is sitting at the edge, and it brings that message schema that was just generated by the connector into the cloud and stores it there. And that becomes the system of record for those schemas. And then schema registry brings that schema back down to the edge and stores it and caches it there so that when it is needed to run a transformation or a data flow at the edge, it is able to use that message schema as that decoder ring for those messages coming from the industrial edge. Now, when we talk about the second flow, this is a different origination point from a schema registry perspective. So in this case, this is a message schema that the user might be providing. So for instance, let's say they've got a flow from some kind of an asset. They already know the payload of that message, and maybe they're using a different connector. And here, they're able to use the operator experience, which is that opinionated web-based portal experience that we've built for that operator persona, and they're able to upload a message schema that is from a different source along with a data flow configuration. And in this particular case, both the data flow as well as the schema are synced down to the edge and made available on the cluster.
Mhm.
So just a kind of a quick flow diagram that kind of puts it all in perspective before I pass it over to Tony to talk more about Azure Container Storage enabled by Azure Arc and the role that it plays in all of this. So as I mentioned, you start with the operations experience in the cloud. This is step number one here. You manage your endpoint profile, which you can think of as that industrial device that you're connecting to. You create your asset from the cloud. And both of these are synced as they are Arc-enabled resources down through the Arc control plane over to the edge. Then at the edge, you've got your connector that picks up that asset and endpoint profile. It will connect to that piece of industrial equipment, which is step number 6. It starts to receive that data. And at that point in time, that message schema is generated at the edge. So this is that
Hmm.
decoder ring for the messages. And once that is generated, Schema Registry is responsible for taking that message schema and synchronizing it to the cloud as part of step 8.
Yeah.
And then as we sort of continue, you've got the Arc cluster extension provided by ADR that syncs that asset and endpoint profile back to the cloud. And finally, where I'll pass it off to Tony, is where we have that storage of those message schema that are pulled down from the cloud and stored persistently at the edge in Azure Container Storage enabled by Azure Arc.
So, Dima, super comprehensive solution. One of the questions, and before we go and talk about the container storage part of the solution, one of the questions that I usually have or always get when I'm talking to customers about this type of stuff is what happens when there is a disconnection between the edge and the cloud. What does that dependency really look like?
Yeah, so in this particular case, specific to the scenario we're describing here, one of the key value propositions of Schema Registry is that it not only provides that synchronization piece between what happens in the cloud and what happens at the edge, but it is also caching those message schema locally. So if you think about a data flow that may need to run
Mhm.
intermittently in a scenario where you have temporary disconnection or something like that, all of the information that the cluster needs to operate is available at the edge. So there's no expectation that you can reach the cloud at any given time for any reason. And while, of course, to bring things down from the cloud to the edge, you need the connection, during that typical scenario where you may have intermittent connectivity or unreliable connectivity, everything that's needed is already there so that you can keep your business operating, even if
Yeah.
the cloud is not immediately reachable.
Love it. Well, Dima, thank you so much for again schooling and educating me and our viewers. I always like to talk to you about this type of stuff because again, I feel that this is kind of the that technology that really brings to life the really interesting use cases when it comes to Azure Arc. So thank you again, Dima, for joining me. And let's bring Tony, to the conversation. Tony, you and I we had some fun conversation last time when you were here talking about Azure Container Storage enabled by Azure Arc. So I'm curious, how does that solution fit into that grand scheme of things with what we talked about with Dima just now?
Yeah, Leor. So last time we talked a little bit more about having data shuttled up to the cloud
Hmm.
using the blob upload functionality. Today, we're going to talk more about high availability.
Hmm.
Um, as Dima mentioned, we want to have the most robust system for IoT operations, and so as part of that, Azure Container Storage, enabled by Azure Arc, is a foundational service that's available at the edge for Arc connected Kubernetes to be able to
Hmm.
give a fault tolerant, highly available file system for the pods that are running all of those key business functions.
Hmm.
So we allow and enable that data to be available to all the nodes in the system for that usage.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I wanted to talk just a little bit about the architecture. I mentioned there's cloud ingest, and that's on the right side of the diagram. But today we really want to talk about the local shared volumes that are persisted by Azure Container Store on the local nodes. So in Kubernetes clusters that have 3 or more nodes, we can set up Azure Container Storage enabled by Azure Arc with the Azure Container Storage subcomponent available to allow for fault tolerance and replication across the nodes in the cluster. So if you have a node failure, which we'll look at here in a little bit, you can still maintain operations even in the face of that failure. So it's a large benefit for not just IoT operations, but also any applications that you might be running at the edge. You can take advantage of the Azure Container Storage persistent virtual connections to be able to have that file system
Yeah.
capability.
And Tony, like the thing with this architecture, and this is something that we've been talking about also, in the previous episode. When you work in a Kubernetes environment, you want to take advantage of Kubernetes, right? You want to take advantage of these primitives that Kubernetes, I want to say, native capabilities. HA is one of those things that in a Kubernetes universe you shouldn't think about, right? In the case
Yeah,
of
it's
multi-node
built in.
clusters, it's built in, right? It's one of those things. And until now, Azure Container Storage, enabled by Arc, like we weren't able to do that. And I think that this combination of the use case with ADR really shows the potential of building robust enterprise grade and industrial oriented systems. Like that's really what we're talking about, right? Because everything's got to do with the data. We said it so many times, right? Everything's got to do with the data. And now that we have that pipeline of highly available data pipeline, that's really where things are interesting, and we're seeing people starting to build more robust architectures.
Yeah, and having the Arc enabled foundational service gives you the capability to have that without
Yeah,
having to do a lot of architecting at the edge. So you don't
yeah,
have to design your own file system or buy an off the shelf NAS array to
for
be able
sure.
to have that capability.
Well, Tony, show me the magic. I know you always have demos for me. So
Yeah, yeah. So in our demo, we've got IoT, or I'm sorry, yeah, Azure IoT operations running with Schema Registry that has some schemas for a wind farm, and so we've got some schema files that we have defined in that portal that have now been synced down to our Edge installation, and Schema Registry is responsible for having those outlines available. And during the operation, we will shut down one of the Kubernetes nodes in our 3-node cluster. I'll show the redundancy here. And Schema Registry will be able to continue to provide service in the case of that node failure.
love it.
All right, so let's switch here. So I have my Kubernetes system. I'm currently showing the Azure IoT operations pods. You'll see at the very top, we have two pods for Schema Registry, 0 and 1. So we're running redundancy with two processes. This is scalable. You can adjust the number of pods when you install Azure IoT operations. And then underneath that, Azure IoT Operations is taking out a PVC against the container storage enabled by Azure
Mhm.
Arc. So if we take a look at the first schema registry, we can take a look, and I'm getting pretty under the surface here for this demo. Normally, when you would be looking at this, you would really be looking at it through the operational portal, the user-friendly interface. But I want to be able to show you the files that are physically present. So that's why I'm taking a look here at a pretty low level. So you'll see I've got a motor schema from 127 that is stored locally in my schema registry pod on this node, Ubuntu one. I have another node over here that is also running schema registry, and it has a copy of that schema as well. So if I hop over to this node, and I shut down Kubernetes, I can come over here and I still have full access. So the schema registry still running here has access to all the schema files, and the IoT operations can continue running as it was with 3 nodes.
Yeah. You know, it's one of those demos that you're kind of wondering to yourself, what is it that I'm really looking at? But then when you start to really understand the potential of what we're showing here, that's what I was talking about when it comes to robust systems, right? When it comes to, robust data pipelines, and high availability is just a fundamental building block. And again, we talked about the notion of taking advantage of Kubernetes native capabilities, right? And I actually, and you know me, Tony, I like the fact that you're going into the terminal and just kind of showing me, what's under the hood. So that's always I always appreciate that. Tony, thank you so much for another short and sweet demo. Thank you also for Dima for joining us to present on Azure Device Registry. For the Jumpstart viewers, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure to like, subscribe. We have a couple of good call to actions and a couple of good links in the description down below. Tony, you shared a couple of amazing Jumpstart drops that you contributed to the community, so definitely go check those out. And we're gonna see you in the next time. Bye, everyone.